On a sweltering Sunday morning in August 1831, the Bethel Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, was packed beyond capacity. Black faces filled every wooden pew, crowded along the walls, and spilled out through the open doors into the humid Georgia air. At the pulpit stood Isaac Williams, a tall, powerful man whose deep voice carried the weight of divine authority and something far more dangerous, the promise of freedom. "And Moses said unto Pharaoh," Isaac's voice thundered across the congregation, "Let my people go." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and every soul in that church understood that this was no ordinary sermon. Hidden beneath layers of biblical metaphor was a meticulously crafted battle plan that would shake the foundations of slavery in Georgia and beyond. Before we dive into this intense journey of faith that turned into rebellion, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment below where you are watching this video. This helps the story reach more people and gives us the strength to preserve these powerful memories. Isaac Williams had not always been a preacher. Born in 1795 on the sprawling riverside plantation along the Savannah River, he entered the world as property, another entry in Master Thomas Whitmore's ledger book, valued at $50 and expected to generate a lifetime of profit through his labor. His mother, Ruth, worked in the main house as a seamstress, while his father, Josiah, toiled in the rice fields that stretched endlessly along the riverbank. The riverside plantation was a monument to human bondage disguised as agricultural prosperity. Stretching across 3,000 acres of prime Georgia coastal land, it housed nearly 400 enslaved people who worked the dangerous, back-breaking labor of maintaining the intricate system of dikes, canals, and rice fields that generated enormous wealth for the Whitmore family. The plantation operated like a small city, complete with its own blacksmith shop, carpenter's workshop, cotton gin, hospital, and most importantly for Isaac's future, a small wooden chapel where enslaved people were allowed to gather on Sunday afternoons for supervised religious services. From his earliest memories, Isaac possessed an unusual gift that both fascinated and troubled those around him. He could memorize entire conversations after hearing them once, recite complex passages from any book after a single reading, and most remarkably, he seemed to understand the deeper meanings behind words in ways that made even educated white folks uncomfortable. By age 7, he was helping his mother deliver messages between the main house and the slave quarters, his perfect recall making him an invaluable messenger who never forgot a single detail or instruction. Master Thomas Whitmore was considered a progressive plantation owner by the standards of early 1800s Georgia. Unlike some of his neighbors who prohibited any form of education among their slaves, Whitmore allowed a handful of trusted house servants to learn basic reading and arithmetic, primarily so they could better serve his family's complex needs. He also permitted religious gatherings, genuinely believing that Christianity would make his slaves more docile and accepting of their condition. It was a decision that would eventually cost him everything he held dear. Isaac's exceptional memory and obvious intelligence caught the attention of Reverend Samuel Crawford, a white Methodist minister who visited Riverside monthly to conduct religious services for the enslaved population. Crawford, a gentleman in his early 60s who genuinely believed in the spiritual equality of all souls before God, began working privately with Isaac to teach him advanced reading skills using the Bible as their primary textbook. What Crawford intended as a simple act of Christian charity would instead forge the intellectual weapon that would ultimately threaten the entire slave system of coastal Georgia. The education Isaac received went far beyond basic literacy. Reverend Crawford, himself a graduate of Yale College, introduced the young man to concepts of rhetoric, theology, and biblical interpretation that were typically reserved for white seminary students. Isaac proved to be not just an eager student, but a brilliant one, absorbing complex theological concepts with ease and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of how Scripture could be interpreted to speak directly to the experiences of enslaved people. By age 15, Isaac could read not only the Bible but any text placed before him, from newspapers to legal documents to classical literature. More importantly, he had developed the ability to interpret Scripture in ways that resonated powerfully with his fellow slaves, while remaining subtle enough to avoid detection by white overseers. When Reverend Crawford began allowing him to assist with Sunday services, Isaac's natural charisma and deep understanding of biblical themes drew larger and larger crowds to the plantation chapel. The young preacher's sermons about the Israelites' bondage in Egypt spoke directly to hearts that knew firsthand what it meant to labor without wages under the lash of cruel masters. His descriptions of Moses confronting Pharaoh resonated with men and women who dreamed daily of standing up to their own oppressors. Most powerfully, his passionate preaching about God's promise of deliverance gave hope to people who had been told their entire lives that their only reward would come in heaven. Isaac's influence began extending beyond the boundaries of Riverside Plantation almost immediately. During the brief periods when slaves from neighboring estates were allowed to visit for weddings, funerals, or holiday celebrations, word of Isaac's inspiring preaching drew men and women from across Chatham County and beyond. These gatherings became opportunities for him to quietly identify potential allies and begin building what would eventually become a sophisticated network of communication and resistance. The young preacher possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, quickly identifying those who harbored dreams of freedom versus those who had been broken by years of bondage. He developed different approaches for different personalities, inspiring the naturally rebellious, encouraging the cautious, and gradually awakening the consciousness of those who had never dared imagine life beyond slavery. His methods were so subtle that even close observers rarely noticed the transformation taking place in his audiences. By 1820, Isaac had established himself as the unofficial spiritual leader for hundreds of enslaved people throughout coastal Georgia. His reputation spread through the complex networks of communication that existed among the slave population, field hands who visited other plantations during harvest season, house servants who accompanied their masters on social visits, and skilled craftsmen who traveled between estates to provide specialized services. The turning point in Isaac's evolution from preacher to revolutionary leader came in the spring of 1822, when news reached Georgia of Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. Though Vesey's plot was discovered and brutally suppressed before it could be executed, the very existence of such a sophisticated plan sent shockwaves through slave communities across the South. For Isaac, Vesey's example provided both inspiration and invaluable lessons about organization, secrecy, and the critical importance of timing. That summer, Isaac began subtly transforming his role in the religious services at Riverside. While maintaining the appearance of delivering harmless spiritual comfort, he developed an increasingly sophisticated system of coded language that allowed him to communicate revolutionary ideas without alerting the white overseers who monitored the gatherings. Biblical stories became detailed blueprints for coordinated resistance. The fall of Jericho's walls provided instructions for simultaneous action across multiple locations. David's victory over Goliath illustrated how the seemingly powerless could overcome their oppressors through faith, intelligence, and strategic thinking. Isaac's sermons evolved into masterpieces of double meaning that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. To white observers, they appeared to be conventional Christian messages about patience, faith, and heavenly rewards. To his enslaved audiences, they were detailed communications about organization, preparation, and earthly liberation. His ability to weave these dual meanings together seamlessly demonstrated a level of intellectual sophistication that challenged every racist assumption about the mental capabilities of enslaved people. The preacher also began using his position to gather critical intelligence about the broader region. Through conversations with visitors to Riverside and careful observation of his master's correspondence, Isaac developed detailed knowledge about the locations of weapons, the schedules of slave patrols, the political tensions between different plantation owners, and the geographical features that could aid or hinder a large-scale rebellion. Master Thomas Whitmore, now approaching his 70th birthday, and increasingly dependent on his son James to manage daily plantation operations, remained largely oblivious to the transformation taking place under his roof. He continued to see Isaac as proof that his humane treatment of slaves produced loyal Christian servants who posed no threat to the established social order. When visitors complimented him on his well-behaved and apparently contented slave population, Whitmore proudly attributed their good behavior to the religious instruction they received. James Whitmore, however, possessed sharper instincts than his aging father. Having studied the latest theories about slave management during his education in Charleston, James harbored deep suspicions about the wisdom of allowing slaves to gather in large groups for any reason, even religious services. He had read detailed accounts of slave rebellions in other states and noted that many of them had been organized around religious gatherings. By 1825, he was pressuring his father to restrict Isaac's role in the plantation's religious activities. The growing tension between father and son created an opportunity that Isaac exploited with masterful subtlety. Rather than openly opposing restrictions on his activities, he positioned himself as a loyal servant, caught between conflicting instructions from his masters. This approach allowed him to maintain his father's protection while gradually working to undermine James's influence. Isaac understood intuitively that divided authority among his oppressors created opportunities for greater freedom of action. During this period, Isaac also began developing the core group of trusted allies who would eventually help him execute his revolutionary plans. These individuals were chosen with extraordinary care, selected not only for their commitment to freedom, but also for their specific skills and positions within the plantation hierarchy. Samuel, the plantation's head carpenter, could provide tools and weapons. Marcus, who worked in the stables, had intimate knowledge of horses and transportation. Rebecca, a house servant, had access to information about the movements and plans of the White family. By 1828, Isaac's network had grown to include trusted contacts on more than 20 plantations across 3 Georgia counties. Communication between these far-flung allies was maintained through an ingenious system that combined legitimate activities with covert messaging. Funeral attendances, wedding celebrations, and harvest festivals became opportunities for coordination and planning. Seemingly innocent conversations about crops, weather, and family news concealed detailed discussions about weapons, timing, and strategy. Isaac's understanding of military strategy came from multiple sources. He had carefully studied biblical accounts of battles and campaigns, drawing lessons from Joshua's conquest of Canaan, Gideon's victory over the Midianites, and other Old Testament military campaigns. He also observed the movements of Georgia militia units during their training exercises and listened carefully to veteran stories about tactics used during the War of 1812. Most importantly, he understood that any successful rebellion would need to be swift, coordinated, and absolutely ruthless in its execution. The preacher's vision for liberation extended far beyond a simple uprising. He envisioned a carefully orchestrated campaign that would simultaneously strike multiple targets, capture strategic locations, and create conditions that would make it impossible for the white authorities to quickly restore order. His plan called for coordinated attacks on arsenals and weapon depots, the capture of key transportation routes, and the establishment of defensible positions where freed slaves could gather and organize for sustained resistance. Isaac also understood that success would require more than just military action. He began developing plans for governing liberated territories, establishing communication with sympathetic whites who might provide assistance, and potentially negotiating with government authorities for recognition of freed slaves' rights. His vision was nothing less than the complete transformation of Georgia's social and economic system. As the 1820s drew to a close, Isaac Williams had evolved from a gifted young slave into something far more dangerous, a revolutionary leader with the intellectual capacity to plan sophisticated campaigns, the charisma to inspire absolute loyalty among his followers, and the patience to prepare his movements with meticulous care. The boy who had learned to read through Bible study was now ready to write his own chapter in the long struggle for human freedom. The catalyst for Isaac Williams' transformation from spiritual leader to revolutionary commander came in the summer of 1829, when news reached Riverside Plantation of a horrific incident that would forever change his approach to resistance. Sarah, a 16-year-old house servant from the neighboring Magnolia Grove plantation, had been beaten to death by her master for allegedly stealing a piece of bread to feed her younger brother. The brutality of her murder: she had been whipped with a cat-o'-nine-tails embedded with metal fragments until she bled to death, sent shockwaves through the entire enslaved community of coastal Georgia. Isaac attended Sarah's funeral on a scorching July afternoon, delivering a eulogy that marked his definitive transition from preacher of patience to apostle of action. Standing before nearly 200 grieving slaves from dozens of plantations, Isaac's voice carried both divine authority and unmistakable revolutionary fire as he declared, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes he works through the righteous anger of his people." Sarah's blood cries out from the ground, demanding justice that will not come from earthly courts, but must be delivered by those who truly serve the Almighty. Those words, seemingly directed toward heaven, were actually a carefully coded declaration of war against the entire slave system of Georgia. In the weeks following Sarah's funeral, Isaac began the most dangerous and sophisticated organizational effort in the history of American slave resistance, the systematic preparation of a coordinated rebellion that would simultaneously strike multiple targets across 3 counties, liberating thousands of enslaved people and establishing free territory that could be defended against counterattack. The first phase of Isaac's plan involved expanding his network of trusted allies far beyond the confines of Riverside Plantation. Using the legitimate movement of slaves between estates for seasonal work, religious gatherings, and family visits, Isaac identified and carefully recruited key individuals on more than 30 plantations throughout Chatham, Bryan, and Liberty counties. These weren't random selections, but strategic choices based on each person's specific skills, position within their plantation hierarchy, and demonstrated commitment to the cause of freedom. Samuel Henderson, the master carpenter at Riverside, became Isaac's chief weapons coordinator. Using his legitimate work repairing buildings and crafting furniture, Samuel began secretly manufacturing pikes, clubs, and crude swords that could be concealed within normal woodworking materials. More importantly, Samuel used his skills to create hidden compartments in slave quarters where weapons and supplies could be stored without detection. His carpentry work also provided him with legitimate reasons to visit other plantations, allowing him to establish weapon caches at strategic locations throughout the region. Marcus Thompson, who managed the horses at Riverside stables, took responsibility for transportation and communication. He trained a carefully selected group of riders who could carry messages between plantations rapidly and secretly. Marcus also identified the locations of every horse, mule, and wagon in the region, creating detailed plans for seizing transportation assets that would be crucial for both the initial attacks and subsequent movement of freed slaves to defensible positions. Rebecca Foster, one of the few enslaved people who could read and write, became Isaac's intelligence coordinator. Working as a house servant, she had access to newspapers, letters, and conversations among white family members that provided crucial information about militia movements, political developments, and the schedules of local officials. Rebecca developed an intricate system for gathering and transmitting information that allowed Isaac to track potential threats and identify opportunities with remarkable precision. The psychological preparation of potential rebels proved even more complex than the logistical planning. Isaac understood that successful revolution required not just organization, but absolute commitment from participants who would be risking not only their own lives, but the lives of their families. His sermons during this period became masterpieces of coded motivation, using biblical language to prepare his followers mentally and emotionally for the violence that would be necessary to achieve freedom. Isaac's interpretation of the story of Joshua's conquest of Canaan became a detailed blueprint for coordinated military action. Joshua's instructions from God to show no mercy to enemies paralleled Isaac's conviction that successful rebellion would require the complete elimination of armed resistance from slaveholders. His sermons about the Israelites' systematic destruction of Canaanite cities provided his followers with religious justification for what would necessarily be brutal warfare against their oppressors. The preacher also drew extensively on the story of Gideon, whose victory over the Midianites demonstrated how a smaller force could defeat a larger enemy through superior strategy and divine favor. Isaac used this narrative to explain how careful coordination and simultaneous attacks could overcome the numerical advantages held by white militia forces. His detailed descriptions of Gideon's battle tactics were actually instructions for the specific methods his followers would use during their own uprising. Training for the rebellion required extraordinary secrecy and creativity. Isaac organized what appeared to be innocent social gatherings, harvest celebrations, wedding receptions, and funeral ceremonies that were actually intensive preparation sessions for armed conflict. During these events, trusted allies taught weapons handling, battlefield communication, and small unit tactics to carefully selected groups of potential fighters. The training extended beyond simple combat skills to include crucial operational knowledge. Participants learned to identify and neutralize specific threats, from guard dogs to alarm systems. They memorized detailed maps of target locations, escape routes, and rendezvous points. They practiced moving silently through various types of terrain, from rice fields to dense forests. Most importantly, they developed the mental discipline necessary to maintain secrecy even under interrogation or torture. Isaac's network also included crucial alliances with free blacks and sympathetic whites who could provide support that enslaved people could not obtain themselves. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a free black physician in Savannah, secretly provided medical supplies and training that would be essential for treating wounded rebels. Several white abolitionists, including Reverend David Matthews from Connecticut and merchant Jonathan Pierce from Philadelphia, provided financial support and promised to advocate for recognition of any liberated territory by northern states. The most dangerous aspect of the preparation involved acquiring firearms and ammunition. Isaac understood that pikes and clubs would not be sufficient for sustained combat against armed militia forces. Through a complex network involving free blacks, sympathetic whites, and corrupted overseers, his organization began secretly purchasing and stockpiling guns, powder, and shot. These weapons were hidden in locations throughout the region, from abandoned buildings to specially constructed underground caches. By early 1831, Isaac had assembled what was arguably the most sophisticated slave rebellion network in American history. His organization included more than 300 active participants spread across dozens of plantations, with detailed plans for coordinated attacks on specific targets chosen for maximum strategic impact. The primary objectives included seizing the federal arsenal in Savannah, capturing the courthouse and jail, controlling key bridges and ferry crossings, and establishing defensible positions where freed slaves could gather and organize for sustained resistance. The rebellion's timing was carefully coordinated with external factors that would maximize chances of success. Isaac planned to launch the uprising during the late summer harvest season, when many white men would be occupied with agricultural work and separated from their families. He also timed the action to coincide with a period when federal troops were stationed far from Georgia, reducing the likelihood of immediate military intervention. Isaac's personal motivation during this period was intensified by changes in his own family situation. His wife Naomi gave birth to their second child, a daughter named Hope, in the spring of 1831. Holding his newborn daughter, Isaac experienced a profound emotional awakening about what freedom would mean, not just for his generation, but for the children who would grow up in the world his rebellion might create. Hope's birth transformed the uprising from an act of vengeance into a sacred duty to future generations. The preacher also grappled with the moral complexity of his planned actions. His deep Christian faith made him acutely aware that the rebellion would inevitably involve killing people, including some who might be relatively innocent of the worst crimes of slavery. Isaac spent many sleepless nights wrestling with these ethical questions, ultimately concluding that the systematic brutality of slavery constituted a crime against God that justified extreme measures in response. As summer 1831 approached, Isaac faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. Some of his followers, frustrated by months of preparation without action, began pushing for immediate rebellion regardless of conditions. Others, terrified by increasing rumors of slave unrest and corresponding increases in security measures, argued for postponing or abandoning the plan entirely. Isaac used all his skills as a preacher and leader to maintain unity within his organization while making final preparations for what he knew would be the most important moment of his life. The internal tensions within Isaac's network were complicated by news of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in August 1831. While Turner's uprising inspired many of Isaac's followers, it also led to dramatic increases in security throughout the South and raised questions about the timing of their own planned action. Isaac made the strategic decision to postpone his rebellion until later in the year, using the additional time to refine plans and wait for the security crackdown to ease. During this final preparation period, Isaac's sermons took on an apocalyptic intensity that reflected both his religious conviction and his understanding of the historical magnitude of what he was planning. He preached about the coming day of judgment, when the oppressed would be raised up and their oppressors cast down, about the righteous anger of God being visited upon those who had profited from human suffering, and about the sacred obligation of his followers to serve as instruments of divine justice. October 15, 1831, 4:47 a.m. The pre-dawn darkness that blanketed Savannah, Georgia, was about to be shattered by the most coordinated slave rebellion in American history. Isaac Williams knelt in silent prayer beside his sleeping wife and children, knowing that by sunset he would either be a free man or a dead one. The moment he had spent 2 years preparing for had finally arrived. Across the city and surrounding plantations, more than 300 enslaved people were waking to what they hoped would be their last day in bondage. Each had memorized their specific role in Isaac's meticulously planned uprising. Each carried weapons secretly forged in plantation workshops or smuggled through networks of sympathetic allies. Each understood that failure meant not just death, but the brutal execution of everyone they loved. Isaac's final preparations had been completed during a midnight meeting at Bethel Baptist Church, where 37 key lieutenants received their final instructions. The rebellion would begin simultaneously at dawn across 7 strategic locations, creating chaos that would prevent effective, coordinated response from white authorities. Samuel Henderson would lead the assault on the federal arsenal. Marcus Thompson would capture the stable complex that housed the militia's horses. Rebecca Foster would coordinate the liberation of slaves from the city's holding pens. Isaac himself would strike at the heart of Savannah's power structure, the courthouse where slave auctions were held and legal documents of bondage were stored. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist rising from the Savannah River, Isaac gave the signal that launched his revolution. A series of fires lit simultaneously across the city, their smoke columns visible for miles, announcing that the day of reckoning had begun. Church bells began ringing frantically as word spread that armed slaves were moving through the streets. But by then, Isaac's forces were already executing the most crucial phase of their plan. The assault on the federal arsenal commenced at exactly 5:15 a.m. Samuel Henderson, accompanied by 12 carefully chosen men, approached the facility disguised as work detail arriving for morning duties. The 2 guards on duty recognized several faces from previous legitimate work assignments and initially showed no alarm. That changed dramatically when Samuel produced a pistol from beneath his work shirt and calmly announced, "In the name of Almighty God and human freedom, you will surrender this facility immediately." The guards' shocked hesitation lasted only seconds before they reached for their weapons, but Samuel's men were already moving. In less than 3 minutes, the arsenal was under rebel control, with its stocks of rifles, ammunition, and artillery pieces now serving the cause of liberation rather than oppression. Samuel immediately began distributing weapons to newly freed slaves who were streaming toward the facility from surrounding neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Isaac's assault on the courthouse demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence gathering that had made his rebellion possible. His forces knew exactly which entrances were guarded, where the keys to the jail cells were kept, and which office contained the legal documents that recorded the ownership of human beings. More importantly, they knew that Judge Harrison McIntosh, who had sentenced countless runaway slaves to brutal punishments, would be in his chambers preparing for the day's court session. Isaac himself confronted Judge McIntosh in a scene that perfectly captured the revolutionary transformation taking place. The man who had spent decades wielding absolute power over black lives found himself facing an armed slave who spoke with the authority of divine judgment. "Your Honor," Isaac said with cold formality, "you have served faithfully as Pharaoh's judge. Today you will learn what justice looks like when God's people hold the gavel." Judge McIntosh's terrified pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as Isaac ordered his men to gather every document related to slave ownership and pile them in the courthouse square. The burning of these legal papers, which began at 6:30 a.m., created a symbolic moment that resonated far beyond its practical impact. Hundreds of freed slaves watched as the documents that had defined them as property went up in flames, literally and figuratively destroying the legal foundation of their bondage. The liberation of slaves from the city's holding pens proved even more dramatic. Rebecca Foster led a force of 20 women in an assault that demonstrated how Isaac's network had prepared for every aspect of their rebellion. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations that maximized psychological impact while minimizing casualties among potential allies. The holding pens, where captured runaway slaves were kept before being returned to their owners, contained 47 men, women, and children who had been brutally beaten into submission. Rebecca's forces burst through the facility like an avenging army, freeing the prisoners and providing them with weapons and medical attention. The sight of armed slave women liberating their sisters and brothers created powerful imagery that spread rapidly through Savannah's black community. By 7 a.m., Isaac's forces controlled 6 of their 7 primary targets, with only the plantation district remaining outside their immediate grasp. More importantly, their coordinated strikes had prevented effective early response from white authorities. The city's militia officers were scattered across multiple crisis points, unable to mount unified resistance to the rebellion. Communications between authorities were disrupted by the systematic cutting of telegraph lines and the capture of key messengers. The rebellion's success during its first hours created a snowball effect that Isaac had carefully planned for, but never dared hope would be so effective. As word spread that armed slaves were winning victories against white authorities, enslaved people throughout the region began joining the uprising spontaneously. Plantation overseers found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by their former victims. Field hands abandoned their work to march toward Savannah. House servants turned against masters who had trusted them completely. Isaac established his command center in the courthouse that had once symbolized white legal authority over black lives. From this position, he could coordinate his forces while making powerful symbolic statements about the transformation taking place. His first official act was to issue a proclamation that had been written months earlier, but reflected principles he had been developing since childhood. By the authority of Almighty God and the natural rights of all human beings, we declare the immediate and unconditional freedom of every enslaved person in Georgia. We call upon all people of conscience to recognize that slavery is a sin against God and humanity that can no longer be tolerated. We extend the hand of friendship to those who support justice and warn those who would maintain oppression that their day of reckoning has arrived. The proclamation was read from the courthouse steps to a crowd of nearly 800 freed slaves, creating a moment of unity and purpose that demonstrated the rebellion's potential to fundamentally transform Southern society. Isaac's words were immediately copied and distributed throughout the region, carried by riders who had been specifically assigned to spread the message of liberation. However, by mid-morning, the initial euphoria of easy victories was tempered by the reality of organized white resistance. Georgia's Governor Wilson Lumpkin had been awakened at dawn by urgent messages about the uprising and immediately ordered the mobilization of all available military forces. Federal troops stationed at Fort Pulaski received orders to march on Savannah with maximum urgency. Most immediately threatening, local militia companies began converging on the city from every direction. The first serious military engagement occurred at 10:45 a.m. when Captain Robert Anderson's militia company encountered Isaac's forces at the Savannah River Bridge. Anderson, a veteran of the War of 1812, commanded 60 well-armed white men who were confident in their ability to quickly suppress what they assumed was a typical slave uprising. They discovered instead that they faced a disciplined force that had been trained in military tactics and equipped with superior weapons captured from the federal arsenal. The battle for the Savannah River Bridge became the rebellion's defining moment. Isaac personally led the defense of this crucial crossing point, understanding that controlling it would determine whether his forces could receive reinforcements from sympathetic communities in South Carolina. The engagement lasted 4 hours and demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Isaac's planning and the terrible costs of armed resistance. Isaac's forces used guerrilla tactics that took full advantage of their knowledge of local terrain. They created defensive positions that maximized the effectiveness of their captured artillery while minimizing their exposure to militia firearms. Most importantly, they fought with the desperate courage of people who knew that surrender meant not just death, but the torture and execution of their families. Captain Anderson's militia initially attempted conventional frontal assaults that proved disastrously ineffective against entrenched positions held by motivated defenders. The militiamen's confidence evaporated as they took heavy casualties while making no progress against rebel fortifications. By noon, Anderson was forced to send messengers requesting immediate reinforcement, acknowledging that he faced a far more formidable enemy than anyone had anticipated. The afternoon brought the rebellion's moment of greatest triumph and simultaneously revealed the limitations that would ultimately doom Isaac's uprising. On the positive side, rebel forces successfully captured Riverside Plantation in a lightning assault that eliminated Master Thomas Whitmore and his son James while liberating all 400 enslaved people on the estate. The sight of armed former slaves burning the plantation house that had symbolized their oppression created powerful imagery that inspired continued resistance throughout the region. Isaac's personal confrontation with Thomas Whitmore provided emotional resolution to the grievances that had motivated his transformation from preacher to revolutionary. The elderly plantation owner, who had considered himself a benevolent master, found himself facing the slave he had educated out of Christian charity. Isaac's words to his former owner were later recorded by witnesses and became part of the rebellion's legendary narrative. Master Thomas, you taught me to read so I could better serve your family. Instead, I learned to read God's word and discovered that he demands justice for the oppressed. You allowed me to preach so your slaves would be more obedient. Instead, I preached liberation and organized the army that will end your evil forever. Thank you for the education that made this day possible. However, the rebellion's afternoon successes were overshadowed by growing military pressure from multiple directions. Federal troops from Fort Pulaski had reached the outskirts of Savannah and were preparing coordinated assaults on rebel positions. Militia companies from across Georgia were converging on the city, bringing total white military strength to more than 2,000 well-equipped soldiers. Most ominously, reports indicated that similar uprisings in neighboring counties had been quickly suppressed, eliminating hope for the regional coordination that Isaac's strategy required. By 4 p.m., Isaac faced the most difficult decision of his life. His forces still controlled key positions in Savannah and had demonstrated their ability to fight effectively against professional soldiers. However, continued resistance would inevitably result in the deaths of hundreds of newly freed slaves, including many women and children who had joined the rebellion. The alternative, attempting to negotiate some form of surrender, offered little hope given the rage and fear that the uprising had generated among white authorities. Isaac's decision reflected both his strategic intelligence and his deep moral conviction that liberation was worth any personal cost, but that others should not be forced to pay prices they had not chosen. In a meeting with his key lieutenants at 5:30 p.m., he announced his intention to surrender himself to authorities, while ordering his followers to disperse and seek safety however possible. The surrender negotiations took place at sunset on the courthouse steps, where Isaac had proclaimed freedom 12 hours earlier. General James Hamilton, commanding the combined military forces arrayed against the rebellion, expected to accept the submission of defeated slaves. Instead, he found himself negotiating with Isaac Williams, who conducted himself with the dignity of a defeated but unbroken military commander. Isaac's surrender terms were simple and non-negotiable. He would give himself up to authorities in exchange for promises that his followers would be treated as prisoners of war rather than rebellious slaves. He demanded guarantees that captured rebels would not be tortured, that families would not be separated as punishment, and that his own execution, which he accepted as inevitable, would be conducted with the dignity appropriate to a military commander rather than the brutality typically reserved for rebellious slaves. General Hamilton, recognizing both the extraordinary nature of the rebellion and the potential for continued resistance if the surrender were handled poorly, agreed to most of Isaac's terms. The two men signed a formal surrender document that treated the uprising as a military conflict rather than a criminal conspiracy, establishing a precedent that would influence how future slave rebellions were perceived and prosecuted. As darkness fell over Savannah on October 15, 1831, Isaac Williams walked in chains toward a jail cell, knowing that he had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American history. His rebellion had lasted only one day, but it had demonstrated the sophisticated organizational capacity of enslaved people, proven their willingness and ability to fight effectively for freedom, and forced white authorities to acknowledge that slavery could not be maintained indefinitely without constant military force. The Chatham County Jail, where Isaac Williams awaited his fate, was a fortress of stone and iron that had held countless rebellious slaves before him, but never one whose actions had shaken the foundations of Georgia's social order so profoundly. In the weeks following his surrender, Isaac's cell became an unlikely pilgrimage site for both supporters and enemies who came to witness the man who had transformed Sunday sermons into battle plans for liberation. The immediate aftermath of Isaac's rebellion created ripple effects that extended far beyond the boundaries of coastal Georgia. Within days of the uprising's suppression, plantation owners throughout the South were implementing new security measures that reflected their terror of organized slave resistance. Private militias were formed in every county with significant enslaved populations. New laws restricting slave movement, assembly, and education were rushed through state legislatures. Most tellingly, slaveholders began hiring food tasters and sleeping with loaded weapons beside their beds, demonstrating their awareness that Isaac's methods could be replicated anywhere. The trial of Isaac Williams began on November 15, 1831, in the same courthouse where he had proclaimed the freedom of Georgia's enslaved population just 1 month earlier. Judge Harrison McIntosh, who had narrowly escaped death during the rebellion, presided over proceedings that were less about determining guilt than about demonstrating the consequences of challenging white authority. The courtroom was packed with plantation owners, militia officers, and curiosity seekers who came to witness what they expected would be the swift execution of justice against a dangerous insurrectionist. Isaac's defense was managed by Samuel Worcester, a white attorney and secret abolitionist who had traveled from Boston specifically to represent the rebel preacher. Worcester's strategy was revolutionary in its own right. Rather than arguing that Isaac was innocent of rebellion, he maintained that the uprising had been justified by the systematic brutality of slavery itself. This approach transformed the trial from a simple criminal proceeding into a broader examination of slavery's moral legitimacy. During 3 days of testimony, Worcester presented evidence of the specific atrocities that had motivated Isaac's rebellion. Witnesses described the murder of Sarah, the young house servant whose beating death had catalyzed Isaac's transition from preacher to revolutionary. Documentation was provided of the systematic separation of slave families, the rape of enslaved women, and the torture of men who dared to seek freedom. Most powerfully, Worcester read excerpts from Isaac's sermons that demonstrated the sophisticated theological reasoning behind his conviction that armed resistance was not only justified, but commanded by divine authority. Isaac himself took the stand on the trial's final day, delivering testimony that was later described by newspaper accounts as the most eloquent and powerful speech ever delivered by an enslaved person in an American courtroom. Speaking directly to the jury of white men who held his life in their hands, Isaac provided a systematic theological and philosophical justification for his actions that left even hostile observers shaken by its moral force. "Gentlemen of the jury," Isaac began, "you have heard testimony about my crimes against the peace and order of this state. I do not deny that I planned and led an armed rebellion against constituted authority. I do not deny that my actions resulted in the deaths of white men who were considered upstanding citizens of this community. What I deny is that seeking freedom for myself and my people constitutes a crime in the eyes of God or any system of justice worthy of the name." Isaac's testimony continued for more than 2 hours, during which he systematically dismantled every legal and moral justification for slavery, while demonstrating an intellectual sophistication that challenged racist assumptions about the mental capabilities of enslaved people. He quoted extensively from legal philosophers, biblical scholars, and political theorists, revealing an education that had been secretly acquired through years of determined study. The climax of Isaac's testimony came when he directly addressed the fundamental contradiction between American ideals of freedom and the reality of human bondage. "You have built a nation on the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet you have enslaved millions of your fellow human beings, denying them every right you claim for yourselves. If your revolution against British tyranny was justified, how much more justified is our rebellion against the far greater tyranny of slavery?" The jury's guilty verdict was announced within 30 minutes of deliberation, but the damage to slavery's moral legitimacy had already been done. Isaac's trial testimony was transcribed by sympathetic observers and distributed throughout the abolitionist networks of the North, where it became one of the most powerful pieces of anti-slavery literature ever produced. The eloquence and moral authority of his words provided ammunition for abolitionists while forcing even slavery's defenders to acknowledge the intellectual and spiritual capacity of enslaved people. Isaac's death sentence was scheduled to be carried out on January 15, 1832, but the 2 months between trial and execution became a period of intense activity that further amplified his rebellion's impact. Abolitionists throughout the North organized petition drives demanding clemency, while sympathetic religious leaders used their pulpits to denounce both slavery and the impending execution of a man whose only crime had been seeking freedom for his people. The condemned preacher used his final weeks to complete a series of written works that would become his most lasting legacy. Working with materials secretly provided by sympathetic guards, Isaac wrote detailed accounts of his life, his rebellion, and his vision for a future America free from the curse of human bondage. These writings, smuggled out of his cell and distributed through abolitionist networks, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a slave revolutionary and the sophisticated organizational methods that had made his uprising possible. Isaac's Letters from Chatham County Jail became required reading for abolitionists and provided a template for future resistance leaders who sought to combine spiritual authority with practical organizing. His theological arguments for the moral necessity of armed resistance influenced later figures like John Brown, while his detailed descriptions of underground communication networks provided guidance for conductors on the Underground Railroad. The execution of Isaac Williams on January 15, 1832, drew a crowd of more than 5,000 people to Savannah's public square. Authorities had hoped that the public spectacle would deter future rebellion, but the event instead became a powerful demonstration of the support Isaac had inspired among both enslaved and free black communities. Hundreds of mourners, many carrying flowers and singing spirituals, created an atmosphere more appropriate to a religious ceremony than a criminal execution. Isaac's final speech from the gallows lasted nearly 15 minutes and was delivered with the same commanding presence that had made him such an effective preacher. He used his last moments to deliver a prophetic vision of America's future that proved remarkably accurate. The day will come when the chains of slavery will be broken, not by the mercy of masters, but by the power of justice. The blood spilled here today will water the tree of liberty until it bears fruit for all of God's children, regardless of the color of their skin. If this journey moved you, subscribe, like, and comment. Which part of the story touched you most? Your engagement keeps these voices alive and inspires new content about resistance and courage. The immediate impact of Isaac's execution was to inspire rather than deter further resistance. Within months of his death, slave rebellions erupted in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, many explicitly inspired by Isaac's example and using organizational methods he had pioneered. The Southern press, while condemning these uprisings, acknowledged that Isaac's rebellion had fundamentally changed the nature of slave resistance by demonstrating that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated military and political organization. More broadly, Isaac's rebellion accelerated the growth of abolitionist sentiment in the North by providing concrete evidence of enslaved people's desire for freedom and their capacity for organized resistance. His trial testimony and prison writings were widely circulated, helping to create a new narrative about slavery that emphasized the agency and humanity of enslaved people, rather than depicting them as passive victims of oppression. The long-term influence of Isaac Williams extended far beyond the immediate impact of his rebellion. His integration of religious leadership with revolutionary organizing became a model for later civil rights leaders who understood that moral authority was essential for sustaining political movements. Frederick Douglass explicitly acknowledged Isaac's influence on his own development as both a preacher and an abolitionist, while Harriet Tubman used organizational methods pioneered by Isaac's network in her work with the Underground Railroad. Isaac's emphasis on education and literacy as tools of resistance also had lasting impact on African American communities. His example inspired the creation of secret schools throughout the South, where enslaved people learned to read and write, despite legal prohibitions. These clandestine educational networks played crucial roles in preparing future generations for freedom and citizenship. The physical sites associated with Isaac's rebellion became important landmarks in the geography of American freedom. Bethel Baptist Church, rebuilt after being damaged during militia reprisals following the uprising, continued to serve as a center of resistance activity throughout the antebellum period. The church's congregation included conductors on the Underground Railroad, organizers of petition drives for fugitive slaves, and supporters of John Brown's activities in Kansas and Virginia. The courthouse where Isaac proclaimed freedom and later stood trial became a powerful symbol of both oppression and resistance. During Reconstruction, newly freed slaves held their first political meetings in the same building where their enslaver had been sentenced to death for demanding their liberty. The symbolic importance of the location was not lost on participants, who explicitly connected their newfound political rights to the sacrifice made by Isaac and his followers 30 years earlier. Academic historians began recognizing the significance of Isaac's rebellion in the 1960s, when civil rights movement scholars sought to document the long history of African American resistance to oppression. Research revealed that Isaac's organizational methods had been far more sophisticated than previously understood, with communication networks that extended across state lines and coordination mechanisms that anticipated techniques used by 20th century civil rights organizers. The discovery of Isaac's prison writings in the 1970s provided new insights into his intellectual development and strategic thinking. These documents revealed a man whose understanding of political theory, military strategy, and organizational psychology rivaled that of formerly educated leaders of his era. His analysis of slavery's vulnerabilities and his predictions about the conditions that would eventually lead to emancipation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of historical forces that few of his contemporaries possessed. Contemporary recognition of Isaac Williams's historical significance reached its peak in 2019 with the dedication of the Isaac Williams Memorial in Savannah's Forsyth Park. The memorial, featuring a bronze statue of Isaac, delivering a sermon flanked by quotes from his trial testimony and prison writings, serves as a reminder that the struggle for human freedom has taken many forms and required countless acts of courage from ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Today, Isaac Williams is recognized as a pivotal figure in the long struggle for civil rights and human dignity in America. His life demonstrates that resistance to oppression can emerge from unexpected sources and take forms that challenge conventional understanding of political action. His transformation from enslaved preacher to revolutionary leader illustrates the capacity for moral conviction to overcome seemingly impossible odds when combined with strategic intelligence and organizational skill. Isaac Williams died at age 37, but his vision of an America where all people could live in freedom and dignity continues to inspire new generations of activists and leaders. His story reminds us that the pursuit of justice requires not only moral conviction, but also the courage to act on that conviction, even when the personal costs are enormous. The preacher who turned Sunday sermons into battle plans for liberation left a legacy that extends far beyond his brief life, proving that one person's commitment to justice can indeed change the course of history. If this incredible story of courage and resilience moved you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join our community of history seekers. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of Isaac's journey inspired you the most, and give us a like if you believe that these untold stories of American resilience deserve to be heard.